Chapter 31, Magnitude. Upon entering the maze, I felt my eyes drawn up into the sky, where colossal walls reigned king and vibrant aquamarine blocked out the sun. It seemed excessive, certainly, but the maze's sheer magnitude worked as intended and made me feel quite small. Tiny, even. But I hadn't got to this point just to give up now, and strapped with my laser gun, I planned to bring a fight. Today, I recognized that I was both the hunter and hunted, the mouse and the machine, and I knew that whoever passed this test would earn the perfect storm of praise, riches, and fame. Easily, this day was the most significant of my whole life. And so, starting with a single step forward, I began to move. It was a bit awkward at first, and I had to learn the pace of when to take a turn, but I soon got used to the rhythmic aspect of the maze. Whenever the path diverged, I thought back to my planned strategy and would go straight, or else to my initial left. This way, I had to count my turns, but I figured it was worth it to help me not get lost. By continuing one direction as much as possible, I would also either find the center of the maze or another edge, which would gain me information no matter what. And information really was crucial. So, as I implemented my plan, I tried to take note of the other aspects of the maze. For one, I recognized that I'd started on one edge, as the black marbled wall behind me was much different in substance than the aquamarine elsewhere, and I could also tell that this border was straight, or at least in this section. Of course, there were some flaws in my plan, namely in dead ends that I had to contend with, but I learned to use a line of best fit, tracked in my notebook, to grapple with these blocks, and I hoped that everything would mainly work out. And eventually, it did seem to pay me dividends. After a short period of time, I felt like I'd been able to go quite far, though still in this section, prompting me to become more reserved about meeting other players. With this fear in my mind, I chose to implement another strategy I'd thought about pre-game. The maze was designed to be silent, with the only noise being the footsteps of those who moved. So if I stopped periodically, I could tell if anyone was nearby. And luckily, the first time I checked, nobody was. That made me a little less nervous, and as I continued forth, I kept in mind my strategies. I stayed along the line of best fit as much as possible, stopping about once a minute to check if anyone was here, and did make progress in the maze. And though I was worried said progress may mean finding others, as I was fairly sure the tiles meant our sections of the maze, my precision did eventually pay off when I ran into a wall. Of course, it wasn't finding a dead end that was great, but rather what the wall consisted of. Indeed, it was not the blue-green that had surrounded me thus far, nor the black marbly brick, but a bale full of hay with some grass on the floor. This was great, as it was something new, and when I hit a wall from here, I could triangulate where the center was. In fact, as I doubled back slightly to avoid the dead end, I was more determined than ever to find a pathway through the hay. And this didn't take too long. It was hard to keep an exact track of time spent in the maze, but I figured it had been about 5 or 6 minutes thus far, and around 30 seconds later I found a new pathway. I knew that it was best to go inside the hay. After all, it was what I'd been searching for, but realizing it was likely someone spawned, I did another check to be safe. I had to make sure that I wasn't being tracked. But ultimately, it was not a player I first encountered as the path was clear, but a puzzle instead. Around a minute and a half into exploring the hay sector, I rounded a corner and came face to face with an interactive clock, lectern, shelf, and a dispenser of buttons. Slinging my weapon on my back, I took a deep breath in and realized this was really good for me. Not only could solving give me an extra shard of glass to add to what I had started with, but one of those coveted power-ups. Though I was a little bit confused on how this puzzle was arranged, I at least wanted to give solving a try. I looked at the lectern and saw a diagram. And there's a puzzle here. And I must confess that I was initially perplexed at the puzzle. The lectern didn't give me instructions alongside the diagram, so I figured that must mean I had enough to solve the puzzle as it was. But that was far easier said than done. The first thing I assumed was that the ratios were times, as it made sense with the clock present, and there were no real alternatives. But then, guessing that the crosses were plus signs, things got nonsensical again, as the 2 times on the bottom right added up to 19 hours 36, which was far over the standard 12. And it took me a good minute to realize this was no accident, but a design of the puzzle, which did use addition after all. Looking carefully, I couldn't help but shake that the sum 19 hours 36 so closely matched the time above, just with the wrong hours. And when I finally thought back upon the features of the clock, it seemed all too obvious. Time was a circle, after all, and by converting to military time, I could get the answer to 19 hours 36. So, understanding how the times would be solved, the puzzle became a matter of math and getting the answers. B was the easiest letter, as I simply added 342 to 740 to get 1122 quite easily. And, while the other two variables would take many steps to solve, I knew all of the factors to get to C eventually, and thus started there first. To get there, I added 1122 to 736 to get 1858 in military time. Then, subtracting the necessary 12 hours got me to 658, and combined with 110, I could add up to gold. When I did, I got 808 for answer C, and from there, I recognized I'd have to work backwards to try and find A. So that's just what I did. It was a two-step process, but I knew that 110 could be 1310 quite easily, as I had to take a whole 7 hours away. I wasn't fantastic at mental subtraction, so I broke out my notebook to take 717 away and get 553, which, when I added it back up, seemed to be right. From there, I just had to add 1 hour, as it was 12 minus 11, and then subtract the minutes to get 614 as a replacement for A. Then, double-checking I was right, I input all the answers with their respective buttons, going in alphabetical order in case that it mattered. I was confirmed to be correct, and took the laser gun off me to put on the on-shelf, which said I had gained an extra 15 HP. But nice surprises weren't all that I received, for when my glass started to dispense, it also sounded an alarm. And, as it rang, I now knew what the prince had meant the day before. Panicking, I knew that should anyone be nearby, they had definitely heard me, and thus I had to flee instantly. So, the second that my shard of glass dispensed, I threw it in my bag, hoisting up my laser gun, and immediately bolted. However, my split-second instinct to keep going forward was quickly put in jeopardy, as once the alarm came to a stop, I heard footsteps running straight towards me. I didn't know what to do. I realized that I still could have turned back and fled to my sector, but I really hated the concept of retreating and breaking with my whole plan. Plus, I must admit, some part of my mind was still filled with fantasies of taking down Ezra, pulling off some perfect juke, and or finding the center. So in this way, I had to go forward, but I didn't really want to fight, and thus decided that I would try to dodge or effectively bypass my attacker. To do this, I made a plan for how to slip by them. If I placed their footsteps correctly, the other player was on my front left, so I chose to sacrifice the right swerve to try and get past them. But as I nearly ran straight into a wall before the pathway turned, I realized I had slightly misjudged my problem. It wasn't just the other person that I had to overcome, but their section of the maze as well. Still, I reckoned I was faster and better at searching than nearly everyone, and as the pathway now was pretty straight, I felt hopeful that I could put some good distance between the other player and me. Yet, after running through the long tunnel, I found that the road ahead split in 3 ways, to the left, right, and middle. And quickly, I knew that I would have to make a choice on where to go if I wanted to escape. And perhaps it was stupid, but I couldn't help but feel that the right would be quite bad, as it would just lead me to my blue and green section, and not even to a pathway I would know. Yet at the same time, I could guess that the left was a mistake, as it might well run straight to my chaser and get me in a fight. So, compromising my options, I took a calculated risk in going straight. But unfortunately, this proved to be an error. The pathway twisted and it turned, but it led to a dead end, and I knew I was cornered. In fact, I had ended up in a different section altogether, surrounded by spruce logs at the end of the road, and by now I was in such different terrain that there was no way to escape. With a sigh, I realized I had to take out my laser gun and prepare for a fight. And clearly, my pursuer recognized this too, as their footsteps got louder and my fears became confirmed. I cursed under my breath, but felt lucky to at least have some advantage in this fight due to my power-up. Being in a corner wasn't great, but it was still early on, and I did have some leverage with the log section's jutted walls. If I could only peek around the corner of the maze and fire some shots out, there was a solid chance that I could win and keep my spot in the game. But my attacker must have recognized this too, as they didn't dart down the dead end like I hoped, and instead came to a slow stop. Clearly, this was a war of attrition,
and I knew they were waiting for me to show my face. It irritated me, not least because I couldn't help but feel like we were both wasting our time. The longer I stayed in my corner here, the more time we both wasted, and the less chance we had to win. So, throwing some degree of caution to the wind, I called my attacker out and challenged them. "If you're gonna fight me, just do it already. We don't want to let the others win," I yelled, but didn't really expect much to change as a result. However, I was taken aback when my pursuer called out too.
"Cassius?" they asked. "Is that you?" Chapter 32, Synthesis. My eyes went wide. "Come on out, I won't shoot," Jade's voice rang out, and I all but sighed in relief. I came around the corner with my hands raised, and my heart just barely slowed down. Then I looked all over her to find her laser gun. It was now loose at her side, but its sight was enough to remind me that I should check we were still good. "So, you want to work together in the maze?" I smiled, and she just rolled her eyes as she shot me a grin. Then, beaming, we traded a fist bump. "It's so good to see you, honestly," I said. "I mean, I hoped we'd be able to meet up eventually, but I never thought this early, or that you'd be chasing me." Jade nodded, but sobered down from sheer delight to thinking hard as she looked at the labyrinth. "Yeah, it's good to see you too, and we should definitely team up. But, I was wondering, what's been your strategy? I mean, until I started chasing you, I'd been in the forest, my dark green section, for nearly the whole time, and I just got into the hay part at the end. But clearly, you've been doing something right, as I wouldn't think that's your starting point." I nodded to confirm her thinking. "You're right, I started in a blue-green section, like my color, but I've been tracing my path." I showed her my notebook. "I've been trying to go as straight as possible, in hopes I can triangulate roughly where the center is. That's also why I wanted to continue straight even when I heard you." Jade took that in, nodding. "Right, well, that does explain some things. But you also solved a puzzle, no? I mean, I'm guessing that's what made the noise and allowed me to find you, but I couldn't know for sure," confirmed her thinking. "Yeah, no, you're right," I clarified. "I guess the puzzles each sound an alarm when you get a shard of glass. But it turned out well in the end, as I also got a power-up for an extra 15 HP. But actually, now that you're here, I realize this triangulation could work if you know the answer to a few questions." "Alright," Jade said as I took out a pen and started drawing diagrams. "So, what do you want to know?" I hummed. "Well, I've inferred a few things from the prince's speech, where he said we'd all start the same distance from the center," I said. "The most crucial being that, whether or not this maze is a circle, our starting places are. But see, that's where things get interesting. We've traveled for roughly the same amount of time, right? With me perhaps going a bit further, but that should mean that if you know your path, we could coordinate a line to where the midpoint is." Jade looked confused, and I decided it would be best to show her directly. "See, we have, through our time here, made an isosceles triangle, with our two paths in the maze intersecting at about the same distance," I said, and drew two lines with a point. "And of course, we could have met each other quicker, had we known where we started and followed this third line," I said, and Jade looked like she was following, but I had to make sure she got the other thing. "So, you see, there are now two places where we could have met up, both in which we did, but also the midpoint of this optimal line. And that makes sense, right? As there are many ways we could have met up by going straight," I said, then connected the dots to make an arrow, just like at the center. "So, see, if you just fill out your general paths on a new page over here, we can make a line to map out all our potential meeting places, and the corresponding arrow should point to the middle," I said, and Jade seemed quite impressed. "Alright," she said, and we both drew our lines on a new piece of paper. "So, then let's trust the process and see where our line takes us." Unfortunately, it proved a bit hard to follow her line, though the logic to make it was sound. Part of the problem was that Jade didn't know exactly where she had started, and part of it was that our times didn't quite match up, so our exact measurements were flawed. But regardless, the line was a big help in letting us get further in the maze, as we were able to confirm when we not only encountered a mushroom section, but what looked like a two-person puzzle too. "Well," Jade said, "this is definitely a new area, and I can't imagine that a two-person puzzle would be along the edge, so we should be closer to the center," she guessed. "But should we try and solve this puzzle before going forward?" I nodded my head. "I think that would be good," I said while scratching at my cheek, "but we shouldn't make the same mistake that I did last time. We now know that beating the puzzle will make a lot of noise, so we should be prepared for a fight to come quickly. Though that might not actually be that bad with two players, since we could always outnumber anybody who arrives, get more shards of glass, and gain some knowledge." Jade gave an eager grin at that, And despite what we'd agreed on yesterday, it really seemed like she was itching for a fight.
Yeah, and we'll have 3 power-ups between us anyways. What with your boost from earlier and the 2 this puzzle should provide. Plus, imagine it's someone like Ezra who we can catch off guard, or maybe we'll even find Mason. Her eyes sparkled at the mere thought.
I suppressed a small grin. Alright then, I'll read the puzzle quietly, and you should check if anyone's around, I commented. Even if it won't stop them from hearing us later, we don't want to be caught off guard, you know, I advised her. And she gave a hum at that, but seemed willing to comply as I read the instructions that were in a lectern.
This puzzle requires 2 people to solve. When you have enough people to attempt it, you should hit the start buttons near both of the doors simultaneously, then enter the divided room. There you will be met with 12 items on each side, which you should interpret and match to the other person's objects in order to form a new third thing. For instance, a pair of ice skates plus a game board could equal a skateboard. But be warned, as some objects may go with several different things, yet just one set of alignments, that includes each of the 24 objects, will be marked correct.
I copied the rules to Jade, emphasizing the last part to make sure she understood the twist. So, it looks like there will be potential repeats in the puzzle to try and solve, which makes sense for the finals, I said. But are you still willing to give it a shot? I mean, I am, but we could always change our mind. Yeah, Jade said openly, then confirmed that she could hear no one around.
I'm fine with the puzzle. I think we should try it. So, should I just take the right and you go on the left?
I thought that made sense, and we each pushed our separate buttons to open the doors. Walking inside, the door behind me swept closed, and I realized I could only hear Jade's voice through a peephole in the corner of the room. If we wanted to exit, we would have to push another button at the exact same time. But other than that, we were stuck here. So I decided to look at the shelves on my side of the room to see what my objects were. But just as quick as I saw them, I was confused, as the items didn't have labels and seemed completely random. To start, I found a weird piece of concrete that had been chipped off of a wall, a red X, a hammer, a globe, dead fish, and a corresponding worm. Likewise, the bottom shelf seemed as disorganized, as I found some sticky note, a vial of sand, a telephone, a kid's sneaker, a thin slit of glass, not the shard that we needed, and an odd blob of something that I didn't even know. Furthermore, when I tried to pull the hammer off the shelf, I found that the objects wouldn't budge, and were instead stuck to the wall. So, what objects do you have on your side of the room? I asked Jade through the peephole as she looked at her objects. Like, I'm not really seeing what some of my things could be. So if you're understanding more, then I think you should go first, I offered her.
Okay, she said. The items are weird in here too, but I'll describe them generally. She began to list her things to me. So I have a cardboard box, an 8-point star, a small book, corn husk, the number 5, and the head of a mannequin on the top shelf, and a clock stuck at 1, bow tie, get well soon card, snow, I think, a weird theater-like scene, and a sculpted horse on the bottom. So what have you got over there?
I repeated my list to her, and she hummed for a second, apparently thinking on what we should do next.
So, how many of your objects could you confidently assign a word to? She asked. 'Cause if we can get 8 or so, perhaps, on each of the sides, then we'll have a good start.
I frowned, but figured that it made at least some sense. If we could puzzle out the words, we could start to put things together. Okay, I'm pretty sure that fish, hammer, globe, worm, phone, sand, and shoe are all objects. And both cross and glass would also make sense for what I have. But I'm not sure what the other 3 could be, I admitted.
That's fine, Jade said through the peephole. And I think that snow, star, book, box, corn, horse, number, and head are likely 8 of the words for me. So maybe if we write all those down, we could find all the possible combinations, she asked, and I agreed with that. Like, maybe we'll have more than one answer, but if we can narrow down the choices, I think that would work best.
I thought Jade's logic was sound, and made a list in my notebook of each word I had with Jade's potential matches. Of course, there were a lot of words that went with more than one thing, like how shoe could go with snow or horse quite easily. But there was also a trick to the puzzle. Notably, the prints had given us some outliers to start, like the hammer, which had to go with the mannequin head as far as I saw it. And starfish seemed like an obvious and only match as well, so I put those 2 down. But I didn't pretend to be the best at creative puzzles, and Jade was much better than me in finding these answers. Just 2 minutes after I'd gotten the initial matches, she'd managed to fly through the puzzle, having traced all possible connections before working backwards, and she was now using the 3 objects I didn't even know were on my side.
See, mushroom makes a lot of sense, especially for where we are, and I bet that ties into that shapeless object, she said, then muttered a series of other words. And cornflake would work more than snowflake, right? As a word could only fit with snow globe. So really, that just leaves a few objects, like sandbox and note card, which would solve the puzzle.
Honestly, I had no clue how she came to that outcome, and I felt like I barely helped, but I trusted her enough to wager she was right. I was very lucky that I got into this point without too many word puzzles, as I was really only good at word searches and scrambles. Of course, I was also good at factually thinking and using known variables, but I liked to leave it to others to handle the abstract. That said, Jade was more than good at it, and so she got the answer right, all while instructing me which answers to input on our weird magic locks. But just as we put in the last pair, and our shard of glass dispensed, the alarm rang out again. Quickly, we each received the power-up that was chosen for our side, with me getting a 25% shield to every shot, and Jade getting +4 to her damage when below half her health. Yet, even before we collected everything, we heard the familiar footsteps that signaled someone was coming. And this time, with the numbers 2-on-1, I felt more confident in my position to fight.
Chapter 33, Purpose. As the sound of footsteps became louder and louder, Jade and I waited in anticipation to see who would come. And as it happened, the person who met us was Elias. So far, he'd gambled a lot inside the game, but in the finale, when everything mattered, it seemed like his luck was running thin. He turned around the corner to see Jade and I ready, weapons in hand, and immediately pivoted backwards to run away. But this was a critical mistake. See, had Elias shown us that he meant no real harm, and tried to negotiate, we might have considered sparing him. After all, he'd never really worked for or against us, and Ezra was still the biggest threat to all our games. But in turning his back on us without a second thought, he essentially stated that we weren't on his side, and thus needed us gone. So of course, Jade and I, with the numbers, went to chase after him. We started firing our laser guns and running after him, knowing we couldn't just let him get away. If he did, he could tell anyone that Jade and I were working together, and he'd only be more frustrating to take out later. So we continued our pursuit until he made another big mistake, as he stumbled into the forest sector. Just as I had been trapped earlier, Elias was in unknown terrain, and it wasn't long until he found himself cornered when facing a dead end. But to his credit, he didn't just resign. Huffing and puffing, Elias was clearly exhausted, but he was also more determined than ever to give us his best fight. Seeing this, and knowing that he was in a position with nothing left to lose, I told Jade to hold her ground as things could get ugly. It was a good warning, and well needed too, as Elias kicked off of the wall behind him and began to charge, shooting blindly and trying to penetrate our defenses. But things didn't quite work out for him. He managed to shoot us both several times as he ramped up his speed, and he even broke through our human wall with his effort, but he couldn't escape. Jade ended his health bar before he had the chance to disappear, and he fell forth in agony and exhaustion. And as I saw him wheezing on the floor, completely heartbroken, I must admit I felt a little bad. This was a game that only one person could win, but it clearly meant a lot to LES, and so I wanted to at least leave him with something. Hey, you played a good game, I said, as Jade took the 3 shards of glass from its person. And I wanted you to know, this was nothing against you. I really liked your message yesterday, and hope you keep at it. But unfortunately, we had to take you down. After all, we couldn't risk you telling anyone about the 2 of us, I said, and he grimly nodded before we walked away. Still though, I couldn't shake how the success felt a lot more bitter than all the other times. And maybe it was in part due to that bittersweet feeling, but after Elias's fall, Jade and I seemed to feel a seismic shift inside the game, not all of which was positive. As it turned out, Elias's 2 power-ups had boosted both his damage, 4 to 6 per shot, and reload speed, which really had given his desperate charge an extra punch. Jade was now at 62 HP and nearing the point where her ability would activate, and I was just a little bit better at 74.5 hit points due to my 2 power-ups. That may not seem meaningful on its own, but considering my first advantage was now worse than nullified, and Elias's power-ups weren't transferable, the fight had certainly stung. But of course, we had got 3 shards of glass as a trade-off, which was worth it to me. And, a bit surprisingly, Jade elected to share these shards of glass instead of keeping them to herself. I had somewhat thought that we were playing a whatever happens does sort of alliance game, but this move was certainly welcome. Whether it was to keep me as a shield, since I had earned the glass, or as some sort of bribery, I didn't know, But in willingly giving up one of the shards of glass before I even asked, Jade really reaffirmed her loyalty. In fact, this act made me feel that I should give her something in return, both to stay in her graces and since she'd helped so much in both the fight and the puzzle. And luckily, I knew just what she wanted. "Hey, do you think it's about time we should start looking for Mason?" I asked while we continued to walk through the forest sector. I mean, I think we're close enough to the center that it wouldn't really be of harm to find his section first and then scout around there. Plus, it would confirm we're converging to the middle, right? Instead of going the wrong way. Jade failed to hide a grin. "Yeah, that would definitely give us a strategic advantage," she said dreamily, her eyes shot open like balloons. "But don't you think it would be difficult to actually find him? I mean, you alone have been in 4 sectors by now, and it's not like we could just summon him to where we are." She slightly deflated at the words, but I didn't give up. I wanted to prove my loyalty. "Well, I'm not quite sure that last part's true," I said, and felt Jade's eyes on me. "I mean, I think there's definitely a way that we can try to call him out. Solving a puzzle will always set off an alarm, right? That beckons to everyone someone is there. So we could always try to go to his section and then solve a puzzle. Even if someone else arrives instead, we could just defeat them, like we did Elias, and take their valuables." Jade looked up at the wall, and I could tell that she was thinking hard. "Well, I am still in the forest sector, so I suppose there's a chance," she mumbled to herself. "And even if he's just somewhere nearby, yeah, I think we should try it. I mean, it couldn't hurt, right? At least, not more than this fight did," she said the last bit with more certainty, regaining that glimmer in her eye. Shrugged, but though I was happy to go through with this for Jade, I did have some private qualms about her plan. Aside from the obvious jinx Jade had just said, I was more worried about how this move would help her in the long run more than it helped me. Of course, this is why I made the suggestion, to be more selfless than Ish, but I knew that it could be a crux in the future. Plus, there was always a risk that we would have to fight, further depleting our health, and yet, I proposed it all since this move definitely had a huge potential upside. If nothing else, it had already secured Jade's faith for quite a bit. So, Jade and I continued walking until we arrived at our destination. "Oh look, Cassius, that could be a section!" she called out gleefully, bouncing to a crimson landscape. And at first, I must admit, I thought she was being a little sarcastic, as Mason's section seemed to be ablaze, before I realized that this was by design. Hellishly, torches were lying 10 feet up on the walls, and the floors looked quite like blood. But of course, it was all fake, and it matched his red token. Still, I felt like this part of the maze had a creepy aura quite like the castle's dungeon, which always managed to give me the chills. That said, Jade must have been immune to this ominous vibe, as she was beyond ecstatic. "So, we just have to find a puzzle, right?" she asked, and I warily nodded. I was really starting to regret my feared wheel offering, and we hadn't even encountered Mason yet. "What about if we try the left just over here? I mean, he'd have a better chance of hearing us this way, you've got to think." I nodded, then proceeded to follow Jade through the menacing crimson, and to where a puzzle might be. Along the path, we found a stone wall that marked a dead end, and had to turn around to stay in the section. But upon thinking about it, I realized that this might be where the real center was. Were that to be the case, then it was very possible that there were people around. And I cautioned Jade to be as quiet as we could, so as to only reveal our location when we planned to. But luckily, we faced no real adversity before we found the puzzle, which once again happened to be unsolved. Statistically, this was quite likely to be the case, but it triggered some mixed feelings in Jade, who worried that Mason wasn't nearby after all. "He could have just missed a puzzle," I said with a slight shrug, perhaps coping to myself a bit. "And besides, we'll want to solve it regardless, so that Ezra can't. Though, to be fair, as this would make 9 shards, he'll have to take us out regardless if he wants to win." Jade checked her bag as if just realizing how many shards we had. "Oh, yeah, that's neat," she said idly. "But I didn't mean we should ignore the puzzle. In fact, why don't we take a look at its design? I mean, it doesn't have 2 rooms, so that's a start, and we'll likely only get 1 shard of glass here, but we can still help each other to try and solve it." I agreed, and we both looked at what proved to be one of the more unique puzzles in the tournament. Indeed, the enclave that we were in seemed to have been transformed into a makeshift classroom, with 4 rows of desks leading up to a blackboard with names, the answering machine, and the traditional lectern. "Well, you're right about the 1 shard thing," I said, as I read the lectern's instructions while Jade stood on guard. "But you might want to take a look at this lectern with me, since I've never seen this type of puzzle before. I mean, it says that we have to figure out which people are sitting at the desks in the front row, but aside from this class list, I have no clue how we'll do that. Like, have you done these kinds of games before?" Jade shrugged at me. No, but look, some of these desks have thin placards, she said, and pointed to some ledgers that were on separate tables. I guess we should probably use the information they give us to arrange who sits where in the room. Plus, the name list that you pointed out would help. I figured that makes sense, and together we read all of the ledgers, then put the information into our notebook, as this wasn't exactly the kind of puzzle you could mentally solve. With every hint that we could find, we emphasized the known information, placed the clues in their places in case that happened to be important, and then centered the class list so we could work more easily. This was the chart we came up with. And there's a huge chart here. I really recommend pausing the video because I'm not going to go over this, but it is important if you want to solve it. But of course, this chart alone couldn't solve the puzzle, so we had to figure out where to go next. Okay, so now that we have this information assembled, let's try to place some names and then cross them out from the list, I said. That way, we'll keep track of who's already solved, and who we still have left to place. So, for instance, we both know that Ellie and Winston are obvious locks, since their clues directly have their names, but also that Damien would be in the top left, according to this corner hint. Jade hummed. That's right, she said, and we can probably go down the list from there. I mean, both Ellie's and the corner clue allude to Ollie and Zachary being in the third row, and we know that 3 boys have to be in the second. So, if we combine that information with Winston's hint about the numbers, I'm sure we can figure some things out. I nodded, carefully observing the board. Yeah, like the 4th person in this 3rd row, for instance, I said. Because if Ollie, Zachary, and Winston are all there, like we think, then the first letters of their names would add up to 64, and we'd be left with a 19th letter name to get to 83. So who does that leave us with? Susan? Jade agreed. Yeah, it should be her, she said, and I marked it on the page. But look, we can also apply that logic elsewhere. Holly, Matt, and Ellie all sit in the back row, with the clue on the top left. So if we do the math again, we should have half the board, she said, and then tallied the numbers in her head. And look, I think the person in the bottom right is George. Okay, I said, but we are searching for the people in the front, and not the back, so let's see if we can focus more up there. I mean, who do you think fits a clue with the rhymes? I asked. Jade scratched at her cheek. Well, it has to be a girl, she cautiously said, because there can only be 5 girls in the other rows, and just 7 in total. And so I'd have to wager then that it would be Roxanne. I mean, tan makes more sense as a color, as well as stand and band for the other hints. I nodded and went along with it. Okay, that's good, I said. And we know that either Amy or Victoria is in the front row too, right? With this girl thing. So surely we can use that knowledge to then test which one it is. I mean, if we add Amy to the other names, the 4th would have to start with a W, while Victoria would leave us with a B. Jade nodded. Yes, and Winston's already been placed, she pointed out, so it has to be Boston. And because of this clue, in the 2nd row, you see, he has to be on the corner. So the order must be Damien, Victoria, Roxanne, then Boston. I grinned, and we nervously input our answer into the machine, knowing that this alarm could trigger a game-changing response. While Jade was here and Elias was gone, there were still 7 others that I didn't know about, and Valerie, Caitlin, Jeremiah, Dakota, Ezra, Mason, and Anthony. Any one of them could walk around the corner and alter the whole maze, so we waited patiently as our alarm began to blare, eager yet nervous to receive a response.